Radio telephony communications between aircraft and ground stations have been a feature of military and commercial aviation since the very early days of flying. But for the larger part of the 20th century, radio was considered a luxury by pilots of light aircraft flying in accordance with visual flight rules. However, after about the 1970s, radios operating in the very high-frequency voice communication range rapidly became a standard fit in most light aircraft, and thereafter aerodromes and airfields began to insist that aircraft operating from them should be radio-equipped. Nowadays, the use of radio between aircraft and ground stations is absolutely essential for the safe operation of both commercial and light aircraft in air traffic environments which are growing ever busier. The name given to the use of radio in this way is radio telephony. In popular everyday parlance, the word radio telephony is often abbreviated to RTF, or, more simply, RT. The abbreviation RTF is mostly used by national aviation authorities, and is the abbreviation you will often find in examinations. RT is the abbreviation most commonly used by pilots. RT communications enable the pilot to obtain information and instructions for the safe conduct of his flight. Consequently, today's aviators need to be skilled radio operators as well as pilots and navigators. It's the aim of this course in radio telephony to help you learn the RT skills you'll need to fly in accordance with visual flight rules anywhere in the world. If you are training to be a professional instrument-rated pilot, this course will teach you all the standard RT operating procedures you need to know. The frequencies allocated to VHF voice communications are those from 118 MHz to just below 137 MHz. Other VHF frequencies are allocated to certain pilot-interpreted radio navigation and approach aids. For instance, the VOR navigation system and the instrument landing system operate in the VHF frequency range 108 MHz to 117.975 MHz. These frequencies are sometimes also employed for the one-way transmission of aerodrome information from ground stations to aircraft. There will also be radio navigation equipment in your aircraft operating on frequency bands other than VHF. For instance, automatic direction finding equipment operates in the medium to low frequency bands, while distance measuring equipment and transponders, both of which work on the secondary radar principle, operate in the ultra-high frequency band. But as this is a radio telephony course, here we'll deal only with matters concerning VHF voice communications. Typically, the VHF voice communication radios are labelled COM, while the VHF radio navigation sets bear the label NAV, as shown here. The frequencies which can be selected on the VHF radios fitted to most light aircraft, whose pilots predominantly fly in accordance with visual flight rules, are spaced at intervals of 25 kHz. For 25 kHz spaced frequencies, the voice communication frequency range is from 118 MHz to 136.975 MHz. This gives a frequency spread of 18.975 MHz or 18,975 kHz. With channel spacing of 25 kHz, this spread allows 760 distinct frequencies to be selected. VHF radios in some light aircraft have only 720 channels, and you may even find older radios which operate on only 360 channels. Neither of these latter two types may be used for IFR flight. In certain countries, including Germany, 720 channel and 360 channel radios are not even permissible for VFR flights. Even the theoretically possible 760 distinct frequencies available to aircraft fitted with 25 kHz space radios have proved too few in congested airspace, such as that above Europe. Consequently, within European airspace, each 25 kHz space frequency had to be allocated to air traffic service units at several locations. Care is required when allocating the same radio frequency to several transmitting stations. Otherwise, frequency overlaps can occur as shown here. Consequently, the sharing of frequencies has to be closely coordinated between nations, and protection areas established within which frequencies cannot be shared. In the areas coloured blue, red and green in the diagram, there is no frequency overlap. But in the areas marked with diagonal lines, overlap does occur. So, if the transmitting stations shown in the diagram were serving aircraft operating in the overlap areas, those stations could not use the same transmission frequency. The higher the altitude, the more widespread the protection area within which frequencies cannot be shared. In the high-density air traffic area of European upper airspace, therefore, 760 frequencies were not enough for the management of high-altitude traffic. More frequencies were required, and so ATC moved to 8.33 kHz spacing. The adoption of 8.33 kHz spacing in the place of 25 kHz spacing increased the number of frequencies available by a factor of 3. On the other hand, allocating new frequencies at smaller aerodromes used by general aviation aircraft in lower airspace only poses fewer difficulties. As a result of the heavy frequency congestion in the ICAO European upper airspace region, a frequency spacing of 8.33 kHz was implemented by ICAO in October 1999 above flight level 245. That's 24,500 feet with 1013 hectopascals set in the altimeter subscale. By 2002, most European countries had introduced a national requirement that 8.33 kHz frequency spacing be introduced for VHF voice communications in their own upper airspace. As a consequence, there is now a mandatory requirement for aircraft operating above flight level 245 in European airspace to carry 8.33 kHz capable radios. It's planned that by 2007 the 8.33 kHz requirement in European airspace will apply to airspace above flight level 195. The rest of the world may soon find that it needs to fall in line with the requirements for commercial air traffic operating in upper airspace to be fitted with 8.33 kHz radios. There are currently no known plans to introduce 8.33 kHz spacing for VHF voice communications below flight level 195 in Europe. Below flight level 195, then, VHF voice communications frequency spacing will remain at 25 kHz, so the majority of private pilots flying light aircraft in accordance with visual flight rules will be able to continue using their existing 25 kHz space radios for the foreseeable future. Nevertheless, VFR traffic flying in European lower airspace regions is affected by one aspect of the introduction of 8.33 kHz spacing. The procedure by which VHF voice communication frequencies are communicated over the RT has been modified. The new procedure must be used by all pilots flying VFR or IFR in both upper and lower airspace, irrespective of whether pilots are flying in an 8.33 kHz radio environment or a 25 kHz radio environment. You will learn about the new procedure in the next lesson. Let's now look briefly at a typical VHF RT communications set. Your flying instructor will teach you how to switch on your radio, how to carry out the various tests, and how to select frequencies. However, there are a few key points we wish to cover in this initial lesson. You'll notice that we depict on screen both 5-digit and 6-digit radios to illustrate our teaching points. All you need to know about the difference between 5-digit and 6-digit radios for the time being is that 5-digit radios show only the first 5 digits of what is a 6-digit frequency, whereas the 6-digit radio shows all 6 digits of the frequency. If your radio is 8.33 kHz capable, it will always be a 6-digit radio. If your radio is a 25 kHz radio, it could be either a 5 or 6-digit radio. Though many VHF radios allow the pilot to select only the frequency in use, modern radios often allow frequencies to be pre-selected. The radios you see here display both the frequency in use and a second frequency which the pilot has pre-selected as a standby frequency. The standby frequency is usually the frequency that the pilot knows he will require to change to in order to speak to the next ground station. This standby frequency becomes the in-use or active frequency when the pilot presses a button. As you see on screen, as the standby frequency becomes the active frequency, it moves from the right side to the left side of the display. At the same time, the previous active frequency moves from left to right in the display and now becomes the standby frequency. With this type of radio, when the pilot dials up a frequency using the tuning knobs, it's the standby frequency which changes. The new standby frequency is then ready to become the active frequency whenever the pilot wishes. Some radios with only a single frequency display possess a memory which allows the frequencies a pilot uses most often to be stored and then selected at will by switching a frequency selection knob from one position to another. Simple radios with single frequency displays often store about 5 frequencies. One of the positions of the knob is reserved for the dialing up of new frequencies, not already stored in the memory. Most radio sets have a switch or knob marked squelch. The squelch facility functions as a kind of filter, muting the receiver audio output when no signal is being received. In this way, the squelch facility permits the pilot to eliminate the hissing background noise caused by atmospheric interference. When squelch is selected, either with the switch or by turning the squelch control knob, the muting action of the squelch suppresses the weak signals, which cause the interference noise, sometimes called white noise, which would otherwise be audible when no signal was being received. With squelch selected, only strong, clear signals from radio transmissions pass through to the pilot's headset.
Golf Juliet Mike. Alexander information. Go ahead.
You should note that if a pilot were communicating with a ground station at maximum transmission range, he would have to deselect squelch in order to improve readability. If a squelch control knob is fitted to your radio set, as opposed to a simple switch, the correct squelch setting procedure is as follows. Set the volume control of the radio set to about halfway. Turn up the squelch control until the background hiss is heard. Turn down the squelch control to the position where the hiss just disappears. This position will be the correct position for the squelch control knob. That concludes this introductory lesson on VHF radio telephony voice communications. The aim of this lesson is that you should learn how to transmit and read back VHF voice communication frequencies over the RT, and how to select those frequencies on your comms set. Because of the recent increase in the number of VHF frequencies being used in air-ground voice communications, procedures for transmitting and selecting frequencies are changing around the world, and it's very important that all pilots should be aware of these changes. You should, therefore, follow the lesson carefully. Although the current procedural situation is complex, you'll find that the RT procedures themselves shake down to a set of very simple rules. In the previous lesson, you learnt that the VHF voice communications frequency range is from 118 MHz to just under 137 MHz. With a 25 kHz frequency spacing, this frequency spread makes available 760 possible frequencies. You've also learnt that because 760 channels were no longer sufficient to prevent interference and breakthrough from transmissions made on the same or adjacent frequencies in European upper airspace, the mandatory carriage of 8.33 kHz space radio equipment was introduced above flight level 245 in the ICAO European region in October 1999. The adoption of 8.33 kHz spacing for commercial air traffic management has made available over 2,250 distinct frequencies in the VHF voice communications operating band. The requirement to carry 8.33 kHz capable radios currently affects only commercial air traffic flying in the upper airspace of ICAO's European region. Military and other government-operated aircraft are exempt from this requirement until 2009, provided they are equipped with both UHF radios and 25 kHz spaced VHF radios. It would be logical to expect, however, that there will eventually be a global requirement for all aircraft operating in upper airspace to carry 8.33 kHz capable radios. In lower airspace, the 25 kHz space radio environment has remained unchanged, and there is currently no requirement for aircraft operating in lower airspace, in accordance with visual flight rules, to be equipped with 8.33 kHz capable radios. There are, however, plans in European airspace to lower the flight level above which 8.33 kHz capable radios must be carried to flight level 195. As an illustration of the increase in the number of frequencies available with 8.33 kHz spacing, the table on screen here lists VHF channels available between the frequencies of 125 MHz and 125.1 MHz. The frequencies available in the 25 kHz bandwidth are marked in blue. The points to note from the table are, first of all, that the number of frequencies between 125 MHz and 125.1 MHz has increased threefold with the introduction of 8.33 kHz spacing. Secondly, that unlike the 25 kHz space frequencies, the actual 8.33 kHz space frequencies are different from their designated channels for transmission over the RT, or for dialing up by the pilot on his radio. For example, whereas the 25 kHz space frequency 125.075 is also spoken and dialed up as 125.075 on a pilot's radio, the 8.33 kHz space frequency 125.033 is spoken and dialed up as 125.035. Similarly, as you see from the list, the 8.33 kHz space frequency of 125.0916 is given the designation 125.090. The increase in the number of voice communication channels did indeed achieve its aim of alleviating VHF channel congestion in European upper airspace. But one undesirable operational consequence of the increase in the number of VHF channels has been the higher probability that frequencies will be misread by pilots when transmitted over the RT and dialed up wrongly. For instance, following the introduction of 8.33 kHz spacing, air traffic management began to experience situations in which pilots were uncertain as to whether a 0 or a 5 was to be tuned in as the sixth digit of a VHF channel. Obviously, communication problems arising from such mistuning of VHF channels represents a serious flight safety and security risk to air traffic. Let's have a closer look at how communication uncertainties arose. On the screen now you see a list of 25 kHz space frequencies alongside the new 8.33 kHz space frequencies. You'll notice that the third decimal place of a 25 kHz space frequency is always a 0 or a 5, that a 5 in the third decimal place always follows a 2 or a 7 in the second decimal place, and that a 0 in the third decimal place always follows a 5 or a 0 in the second decimal place. Therefore, in a 25 kHz space radio environment, it was only necessary for air traffic control to pass, at most, the first 5 digits of VHF voice communication frequencies. For example, when a controller passed the frequency 125.02 over the RT, the third decimal place was always a 5, simply because the second decimal place was a 2. And when a controller passed the frequency 125.25, the third decimal place was always a 0, because the second decimal place was a 5. Likewise, a 7 is always followed by a 5, and a 0 is always followed by another 0. So, a pilot who is setting the kilohertz part of the frequency by dialing through the kilohertz in intervals of 25 kilohertz does not have to concern himself about the third decimal place. Because of the impossibility of getting the third decimal place or sixth digit wrong with 25 kHz spacing, many radios fitted to general aviation aircraft and to commercial aircraft before 1999 displayed only 5 digits of the 6-figure frequencies that you see in the lists on screen. Some radios, though, did display all 6 digits. In a 25 kHz radio environment, it doesn't matter whether a pilot uses a 5-digit radio or a 6-digit radio. He cannot make a mistake about the third decimal place. In the 5-digit radio, provided the second decimal place is correctly selected, the radio itself sorts out the matter of the third decimal place. And in a 6-digit radio, the appropriate third decimal place always appears, provided the pilot dials up the correct second decimal place. But this situation changed with the introduction of 8.33 kHz spacing. Compare the list of 8.33 kHz spaced frequencies with the list of 25 kHz spaced frequencies. You'll see that, as we have already discovered, with 25 kHz frequency spacing, any given second decimal place digit is always followed by the same third decimal place digit. This is not the case, though, with 8.33 kHz spacing. With 8.33 kHz spacing, a 1 in the second decimal place can be followed by either a 0 or a 5 in the third decimal place. The same goes for a 3, 5, 6, and 8 in the second decimal place, all of which can be followed by either a 0 or a 5 in the third decimal space. As a result of this possibility of confusion, it is no longer safe in the 8.33 kHz radio environment of European upper airspace to pass frequencies over the RT using the first 5 digits only. With 8.33 kHz spacing, if a controller asked a pilot to change to 125.06, the pilot could not know whether he should change to 125.060 or to 125.065. Consequently, in order to preclude the possibility of the misreading of frequencies, ICAO introduced in 1999 a requirement which stipulated that, for aircraft flying in upper airspace, fitted with radios capable of operating with 8.33 kHz spacing, all frequencies should be passed over the RT using all 6 digits of the frequency designation, where previously a frequency had been passed using 5 digits. Click on the highlighted frequencies to hear how these 8.33 kHz spaced frequencies are now pronounced. At the same time, ICAO ruled that in order to make clear that an 8.33 kHz channel was being referred to, the word channel would precede the passing of the designated channel. For example, the 8.33 kHz space frequency of 125.033 was to be passed as channel 125.035. You should note, however, that the use of the word channel was discontinued in November 2005. The only exception to the new 6-digit frequency procedure is that if the final 2 digits of the frequency are zeros, only the first 4 digits are given. We'll be looking more closely at procedural rules a little later in this lesson. Click on the highlighted frequencies to hear how these frequencies, ending in 2 zeros, are pronounced using 4 digits only. In 1999, then, a procedure was put in place in upper airspace in the ICAO European region whereby frequencies were henceforth to be passed over the RT using either 6 or 4 digits. Meanwhile, however, procedures associated with the designation of 25 kHz space frequencies used by general aviation aircraft in European lower airspace were to remain unchanged. These frequencies continued to be transmitted over the RT using 5 or 4 digits. Thus, in 1999, the 25 kHz space frequency, 125.075, continued to be passed over the RT in European lower airspace as 125.07. However, this hybrid situation, using 2 different procedures, proved inadequate in removing confusion amongst aircrews. So, in November 2005, ICAO again revised its procedures for passing frequencies over the RT. With effect from the 25th of November 2005, in the ICAO European region, in both upper and lower airspace, all VHF voice communication channels are to be spoken using all 6 digits, irrespective of whether 8.33 kHz or 25 kHz space frequencies are being referred to. Moreover, the use of the word channel in front of 8.33 kHz space channels is to be discontinued. As we've already mentioned, the only exception to the use of 6 digits for designating frequencies is where a channel designation ends in 2 zeros. In this case, only 4 digits will be used in the channel designation. The rule covering new 6 4-digit procedure is promulgated in Amendment 80 to ICAO Annex 10, Volume 2, Communication Procedures, dated the 25th of November 2005. The ruling does allow national authorities the discretion not to enforce the new 6 4-digit frequency transmission procedure in airspace where VHF voice frequencies are separated uniquely by 25 kHz spacing, if there is no operational requirement to do so. And, of course, such airspace should, logically, include the greater part of lower airspace used by private pilots flying VFR. However, the ICAO European Air Navigation Planning Group, EANPG, has already endorsed the concept that only one type of phraseology should be used, and has agreed that the 6 4-digit frequency transmission procedure will be applicable in the entire ICAO European region, in all airspace and at all levels, irrespective of whether a VHF radio channel is 25 kHz spaced or 8.33 kHz spaced. The United Kingdom will introduce the new 6 4-digit procedure for passing frequencies over the RT in both upper and lower airspace for all air traffic on the 1st of May 2006, after a slight delay for the aviation industry to educate and train all those affected by the changes. In the ICAO European region, then, all pilots, including private pilots operating according to visual flight rules in lower airspace, should, from now on, expect to be given VHF voice communication frequencies by controllers in either 6 or 4 digits designations. National authorities in other ICAO areas will obviously make their own decisions concerning general aviation radio procedures in their respective area of jurisdiction. No plans have been announced at present, that is, in February 2006, to enforce the mandatory carriage of 8.33 kHz capable radios by general aviation VFR aircraft in lower airspace. It is only RT procedures which are changing. However, as we have already mentioned, Eurocontrol has already announced that it supports making mandatory the carriage of 8.33 kHz capable radios by aircraft operating above flight level 195. To summarize the situation as it affects private pilots, then, all VFR pilots in the ICAO European region now know that they will be required to be proficient in the new 6 4-digit procedure for passing VHF voice communication frequencies over the RT, and VFR pilots worldwide should be prepared for the possibility of this new procedure being introduced in their region. Because of this present situation, where the world is in the process of modifying its RT procedures, the wisest action for pilots is to learn both the new 6 or 4-digit procedure and the older 5 or 4-digit procedure for passing VHF voice frequencies over the RT. If you do this, you will be able to adapt to local procedures wherever in the world you fly. This radio telephony course from Oxford Aviation Training teaches both procedures. However, in the main body of the course, we will use the 6-4 procedure to illustrate actual communications. In the flight scenario at the end of the course, you may choose to work through the scenario using either the 6-4 or the 5-4 procedure. Thankfully, the rules for both procedures are extremely simple, so confusion is unlikely. Let's now look at each of the two RT procedures in turn. We'll begin by looking at how the two procedures pronounce frequencies when they're passed over the RT. Then we'll go on to looking at how the frequencies are dialed up on a pilot's radio, depending on whether his aircraft is equipped with a 5 or 4-digit radio. We'll start with the older procedure, which we've called, for reasons which should soon become obvious, the 5 or 4-digit procedure. The main thing to remember about the 5-4-digit procedure for passing frequencies over the RT is that this procedure is used only for passing frequencies which fit into a spacing of 25 kHz intervals. In the 5 or 4-digit procedure, frequencies which can be expressed in whole numbers of megahertz, such as the ones you see here, are spoken using 4 digits only, as follows:
123 decimal 0, 124 decimal 0, 125 decimal 0, 128 decimal 0, 130 decimal 0, 132 decimal 0.
The rule here is then that for whole numbers of megahertz, only the first zero after the decimal point is pronounced, and so, in this case, the frequency is passed as a 4-digit frequency over the RT. You should note that this rule applies also to the new 6-4-digit procedure. You will have doubtless noticed that the individual numbers are pronounced slightly differently to the way they are pronounced in standard English speech. This is done in RT communications to avoid misinterpretation of numbers. This pronunciation system will be explained to you in a later lesson. The frequencies on screen now are those expressed in whole megahertz and in tenths of a megahertz. So in these frequencies the second and third decimal places are always zeros, and the first decimal place is always a digit other than 0. These frequencies are also pronounced as 4-digit frequencies as follows:
123 decimal 4, 124 decimal 8, 125 decimal 1, 128 decimal 5, 130 decimal 9, 132 decimal 2.
The rule here is that when the frequency ends in 2 zeros, only the first digit after the decimal point is pronounced, and so, in this case too, the frequency is passed as a 4-digit frequency over the RT. This rule too applies also to the new 6-4-digit procedure. We now see on screen frequencies which are expressed in whole megahertz before the decimal point and in tenths and hundredths of megahertz after the decimal point. So, after the decimal point we might get 0.05 megahertz and 0.15 megahertz, and so on. Expressed in kilohertz, that's 50 kilohertz and 150 kilohertz, etc. With the minimum 25 kilohertz spacing, the second decimal place of these frequencies is always 5, and the third decimal place is always 0. These frequencies are passed over the RT as 5-digit frequencies, as follows:
123 decimal 05, 124 decimal 15, 125 decimal 35, 128 decimal 55, 130 decimal 95, 132 decimal 05.
The rule here then is that when the frequency ends in 10 only, both of the first 2 digits after the decimal point are pronounced. In this format, therefore, we pass the frequency over the RT as a 5-digit frequency. Finally, we see on screen here frequencies which are expressed in whole megahertz before the decimal point, and tenths, hundredths and thousandths of megahertz after the decimal point. So, after the decimal point, we might get 0.025 megahertz, 0.075 megahertz, 0.125 megahertz, and so on. Expressed in kilohertz, that's 25 kilohertz, 75 kilohertz, 125 kilohertz, etc. Of course, with a minimum 25 kilohertz spacing, if there is a digit other than a 0 in the third decimal place, that digit is always a 5. And where there is a 5 in the third decimal place, with 25 kHz spacing, the second decimal place will always be either a 2 or a 7. In the 5-4-digit RT procedure, these frequencies are pronounced as 5-digit frequencies, leaving the final 5 of the third decimal place unspoken. Here is how the frequencies in the table are pronounced using the 5-4-digit procedure.
123.02 124.07 125.12 128.32 130.27 132.42.
The rule here then is that only the first two digits after the decimal point are pronounced. So these frequencies too are passed as 5-digit frequencies over the RT. With 25 kHz spacing, if there is a 5 in the third decimal place, the second decimal place is always either a 2 or a 7. So, provided the second decimal place is correctly selected, the radio sorts out the third decimal place for itself. To sum up the 5-4-digit procedure then, we may simply say that where the frequency designation ends in 2 or 3 zeros, only the first 4 digits are pronounced. In all other cases, for the reasons you have just learnt, frequencies are pronounced using the first 5 digits of the frequency designation. As a reminder of the rules you have learnt for passing frequencies over the RT using the 5-4-digit system, click on the frequencies on screen to hear them pronounced. Now let's look at the new 6-4-digit procedure for passing VHF voice communication frequencies over the RT. Remember that this new procedure has been obligatory in the ICAO European region since the 25th of November 2005, irrespective of whether frequencies are 25 kHz spaced or 8.33 kHz spaced. Remember too that although national authorities have the discretion to retain the older 5-4-digit procedure in airspace where only 25 kHz spacing is used, such as in lower airspace for general aviation traffic, most European nations have agreed to adopt the 6-4 figure procedure for all aircraft in all airspace. The United Kingdom will adopt this procedure in May 2006. The 6-4-digit procedure is simpler than the 5-4-digit procedure. Let's see how it works. Look at the frequencies on screen. They're a mixture of 25 kHz spaced and 8.33 kHz spaced frequencies, because, as you now know, the 6-4-digit procedure applies to both types of frequency spacing or bandwidths. The rule for the new 6-4-digit procedure can be very simply expressed. Using this procedure, frequencies are pronounced using all 6 digits of the channel designation, except where the channel designation ends in 2 zeros, in which case only the first 4 digits are pronounced. Listen to the pronunciation of the frequencies on screen using the 6-4-digit procedure.
123.010 124.025 124.150 125.0 125.085 125.090 128.1 128.110 130.050 132.075 133.040.
Never forget the important airmanship point when reading back frequencies. It is imperative that pilots read back the frequency in full in the exact form that it was passed over the RT by the air traffic controller. Click on the frequencies to hear their pronunciation once more. We now go on to look at how frequencies passed over the RT using both the 5-4 and 6-4 procedures are dialed up by the pilot on his radio. You'll learn how to dial up frequencies using both 5-digit and 6-digit radios. First of all, though, we'll take a closer look at the radios themselves from the point of view of how frequencies are displayed. 5-digit radios will be capable only of selecting frequencies at minimum intervals of 25 kHz. Nowadays, then, 5-digit radios are predominantly used in aircraft which fly exclusively in lower airspace. 5-digit radios normally have 2 frequency selection buttons. One button selects the megahertz at intervals of 1 MHz. The other button commonly selects kilohertz at frequency intervals of 50 kHz in one position. In a second position, usually when pulled, the same button selects kilohertz at 25 kHz intervals. Radios with 6-digit displays may be either 25 kHz capable radios or 8.33 kHz capable radios. The radio depicted on screen now is a 6-digit 25 kHz capable radio. Again, this specification of radio is predominantly to be found in aircraft which operate in lower airspace only. This 6-digit 25 kHz radio functions in exactly the same manner as the 5-digit radio, except that the display shows all 6 digits of the frequency dialed up. Again, there are normally two frequency selection buttons. One to select the megahertz at intervals of 1 MHz, the other to select kilohertz at frequency intervals of 50 kHz in one position, and in a second position to select kilohertz at 25 kHz intervals. On screen now you see a 6-digit 8.33 kHz capable radio. This specification of radio would predominantly be fitted to commercial aircraft which operate above flight level 245 in upper airspace. An 8.33 kHz radio normally has two frequency selection buttons too, but they now function in the following manner. One button selects the megahertz at intervals of 1 MHz. The other button commonly selects the kilohertz at frequency intervals of 25 kHz in one position, and in a second position, usually when pulled, selects channels at frequency intervals of 8.33 kHz. Note, however, in the 8.33 kHz bandwidth, the displayed channel does not always correspond to the operating frequency. You've already learnt this, but here on screen again you see some typical 8.33 kHz spaced frequencies against their designated channels. When a pilot selects channels in the 8.33 kHz band, the channels increase at designated intervals which correspond to the frequencies available as shown on screen here. The full explanation of how frequencies are paired with channels in the 8.33 kHz bandwidth is beyond the scope of this course, but a pilot flying regularly in an 8.33 kHz radio environment should soon become familiar with how air traffic control operates within this bandwidth. Now let's look at how frequencies are selected on a pilot's radio, depending on whether he is flying in a region of the world in which the 5-4-digit procedure is in use, or in a region such as Europe, where the 6-4-digit procedure is being used. We'll start with the selection of frequencies passed over the RT using the 5-4-digit procedure. First, remind yourself of how the 5-4-digit procedure works. The 5-4-digit procedure will be used only in a 25 kHz radio environment. This list of frequencies from 119 MHz to 119.4 MHz illustrates the format of the frequencies that a pilot would hear spoken on the RT in a 25 kHz radio environment. Click on the frequencies to hear them spoken in accordance with 5-4-digit procedure. You'll now learn how to dial up these frequencies on your radio. As you now know, in a 25 kHz radio environment, your aircraft may be fitted with either a 5 or 6-digit radio, so we illustrate both here. When the frequency passed by a controller or ground radio operator ends in 3 or 2 zeros, the frequency will be spoken as a 4-digit frequency. For example, 119.0 or 119.3. Using 119.3 as an example, the pilot dials up the appropriate megahertz digits before the decimal point using the megahertz knob. Then, in the first decimal place of the kilohertz display, after the decimal point, he'll dial up the fourth digit using the 50 kHz spacing button. When frequencies are passed as a 4-digit frequency, the pilot must make sure that the second decimal space is a 0. With a 0 in the second decimal place, the third decimal place will always also be a 0. You won't see the third decimal place in a 5-digit radio, whereas with a 6-digit radio, you will. On screen now, you see the radios being tuned to 119.0. Remember that if you are given a frequency as a 4-digit frequency, read it back to the controller as a 4-digit frequency. When the frequency passed by a controller ends either with a single 0 or with a 5, the frequency will be passed using the first 5 digits. For example, 119.05 or 119.32. Using 119.32 as an example, the pilot dials up the megahertz digits before the decimal point using the megahertz knob. Then, in the kilohertz display following the decimal point, using the 50 kHz and 25 kHz spacing buttons as appropriate, he dials up the final 2 digits to designate the kilohertz. As long as the 2 digits following the decimal point are dialed up correctly, the radio set will sort out the 3rd decimal place digit for itself. Remember that with a 25 kHz radio, if the 2nd decimal place digit is a 2 or a 7, the last digit is always a 5. And if the 2nd decimal place digit is a 5 or a 0, the last digit is always a 0. With a 6-digit radio, you'll see the final digit of the frequency. With a 5-digit radio, you will not see it, but you'll still have the correct frequency dialed up. On screen now, you see the radios being tuned to 122.05. The airmanship point you must never forget is that you must read back the frequency exactly as you hear it pronounced by the controller.
Golf Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta, change to frequency 132.27. 132.27. Golf Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta.
Now try dialing up for yourself a selection of VHF radio frequencies passed using the 5-4-digit procedure. You can use either the 5-digit or the 6-digit radio. When you hear the frequency, select it on the radio by following the on-screen instructions. When the frequency is dialed up correctly, you will hear the next frequency spoken. Otherwise, you will just hear background white noise. There are 7 frequencies in all. Here's the first one.
133.22. 133.22. 133.22. 133.22.
Well done. That completes the exercise. Now let's look at dialing up frequencies using the 6-4-digit procedure. As you've learned, in Europe the 6-4-digit procedure is mandatory in the 8.33 kHz radio environment of upper airspace above flight level 245 and has also recently been introduced into the 25 kHz radio environment of lower airspace. So, all pilots who fly in European airspace, whether they are professional or private pilots, need to know how to operate with the 6-4-digit procedure. First, remind yourself of how frequencies are passed over the RT using the 6-4-digit procedure. The list of frequencies on screen between 119 MHz and 119.150 MHz illustrates the format of frequencies that a pilot may hear spoken on the RT using the 6-4-digit procedure in either an 8.33 kHz or a 25 kHz radio environment. Click on the frequencies to hear them spoken in accordance with 6-4-digit procedure. Notice that the frequencies marked in blue are frequencies which normally will be the only ones available to general aviation aircraft in the 25 kHz space radio environment of lower airspace. Notice especially that the 25 kHz frequencies shown in bold blue font are spoken differently from the way they are spoken using the 5-4-digit procedure. The channels marked in red are channel designations of the 8.33 kHz spaced frequencies. Remember that the channel designations of these 8.33 kHz spaced frequencies have a slightly different value from the actual assigned frequencies. For instance, the designated channel 119.010 MHz is actually a frequency of 119.00833 MHz. If you wish to revise this point, look again at the explanation at the beginning of this lesson. If you do wish to revise the pairing of channels and frequencies in the 8.33 kHz bandwidth, click on the button on screen. After completing your revision, use the quick navigation facility to return to this section. As a reminder, here again are the two rules which sum up the 6-4-digit procedure for passing VHF channels over the RT. When the channel designation ends in 2 zeros, it's passed over the RT using the first 4 digits only. For example, 119.0 or 119.3. In all other cases, all 6 digits of the frequency are pronounced. For example, 119.050, 119.110, and 119.125. You'll now learn how to dial up frequencies passed using the 6-4-digit procedure. First of all, we'll look at dialing up frequencies passed using the 6-4 procedure in the 25 kHz radio environment of lower airspace. This is the context in which most private pilots flying light aircraft, in accordance with visual flight rules in Europe, will hear and use the procedure. The frequencies on screen, then, are representative 25 kHz frequencies. Remember that while light aircraft radios may have either a 5-digit display or a 6-digit display, they will almost certainly be 25 kHz capable only. When the frequency passed by a controller ends in either 3 or 2 zeros, the frequency will be spoken as a 4-digit frequency. For instance, 125.0 or 125.3. Notice that this use of the 4 digits pronunciation in the 6-4-digit procedure is exactly the same as in the 5-4-digit procedure. Using 125.3 as an example, the pilot dials up the appropriate megahertz digits before the decimal point using the megahertz knob. Then, in the kilohertz display following the decimal point, using the 50 kHz selector knob, he'll dial up in the first space the single digit he has been passed to designate the kilohertz, ensuring that a 0 is always selected in the second space after the decimal point. With a 0 in the second decimal place, the third decimal place will always also be a 0. You won't see the third decimal place in a 5-digit radio, whereas with a 6-digit radio you will. On screen now you see the 5-digit radio being tuned to 119.0. Remember that if you're given a frequency as a 4-digit frequency, read it back to the controller as a 4-digit frequency. All frequencies other than those ending in 2 or 3 zeros will be passed by a controller using all 6 digits of the frequency. For example, 125.025, 125.050, or 125.275. If he has a 5-digit radio, the pilot dials up the first 5 digits of the 6 digits he hears. The radio will select the correct 6th digit for itself. If the pilot has a 6-digit radio, he still dials up the first 5 digits. In a 25 kHz radio, the correct 6th digit will appear automatically. Using 125.275 as an example, the pilot dials up the appropriate megahertz digits before the decimal point. Then, In the kilohertz display following the decimal point, he dials up the first 2 digits of the 3 kilohertz digits passed by the controller. To do this, the pilot will use the 50 kHz and 25 kHz selector buttons as appropriate. As we've said, if the pilot correctly selects the first 2 of the 3 kHz digits he hears from the controller, the radio set will sort out the 3rd decimal place digit for itself. With a 6-digit radio, the pilot will see the 6th digit. With a 5-digit radio, he will not. On screen now, you see the radios being tuned to 131 decimal 450. Remember, if a pilot is past a 6-digit frequency, he must read back all 6 digits of the frequency to the controller, even though he may be able to dial up only 5 digits on his radio.
Golf Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta. Change to frequency 131 decimal 625. 131 decimal 625. Golf Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta.
Now try dialing up for yourself a selection of 25 kHz spaced VHF radio frequencies passed using the 6-4-digit procedure, just as you might expect to do while flying in lower airspace in Europe. You can use either the 5-digit or the 6-digit radio. When you hear the frequency, select it on the radio by following the on-screen instructions. When the frequency is dialed up correctly, you'll hear the next frequency spoken. Otherwise, you'll just hear background white noise. There are 7 frequencies in all. Here is the first one.
133 decimal 225.
Well done. That completes the exercise. Finally, let's look at dialing up frequencies passed using the 6-4 procedure in the 8.33 kHz radio environment of European upper airspace. This is the context in which commercial pilots will hear and use the procedure. You should bear in mind, too, that there are plans to extend this 8.33 kHz environment down to flight level 1905. Here is a list of representative channels and frequencies from the 8.33 kHz and 25 kHz bands, which a commercial pilot may be required to dial up on his 8.33 kHz radio. We also depict on screen a 6-digit 8.33 kHz capable radio. Remember that with an 8.33 kHz radio, the 3 digits following the decimal point are selected in steps of either 25 or 8.33 kHz, depending on the position of the selector knob. As you've learnt, in both the 5-4 and 6-4 procedures, when the frequency passed by a controller ends in 3 or 2 zeros, the frequency will be spoken as a 4-digit frequency. For instance, 119 decimal 0 or 119 decimal 1. Using 119 decimal 1 as an example, the pilot dials up the appropriate megahertz digits before the decimal point using the megahertz knob. Then, in the kilohertz display following the decimal point, the pilot dials up the 4th digit in the first decimal place. As these frequencies are all found in the 25 kHz band, he will select these frequencies using the kilohertz selector in the 25 kHz position. As this frequency has been passed in 4 digits only, the pilot must take great care to ensure that the 5th and 6th digits on his radio display are zeros. On screen now you see the 6-digit radio being tuned to 124 decimal 0. Remember that if you are given a frequency as a 4-digit frequency, read it back to the controller as a 4-digit frequency.
Spam Air 347. Change to frequency 131 decimal 6. 131 decimal 6. Spam Air 347.
All frequencies, other than those ending in 2 or 3 zeros, will be passed by a controller using all 6 digits of the frequency. For example, 119.025, 119.065, 119.110, 119.135. With a 6-digit radio, when the pilot hears a frequency passed using 6 digits, he simply dials up all the digits he hears. Notice, however, that only the first of these frequencies, they are highlighted in the table, could be dialed up using the 25 kHz selector. The others would need to be selected using the kilohertz knob in the 8.33 kHz position. Using 119.065 as an example, the pilot dials up the appropriate megahertz digits before the decimal point using the megahertz knob. Then he selects all 3 kHz digits in the kilohertz display, following the decimal point, using the kilohertz selector knob in the 25 kHz or 8.33 kHz positions as necessary. The pilot must carefully check that he has selected the correct final digit, because, as you can see from the table, with 8.33 kHz steps, a 6 in the second decimal place can be followed by either a 0 or a 5 in the third decimal place. On screen now you see the radio being tuned to channel 131.115. Remember that if you're given a frequency as a 6-digit frequency, read it back to the controller as a 6-digit frequency.
White knuckle tree 67. Change to frequency 128.990. 128.990. White knuckle tree 67.
Now try dialing up for yourself the following selection of VHF radio channels passed using the 6-4-digit procedure, which you might hear and use in an 8.33 kHz upper airspace radio environment. Make your kilohertz steps using the 25 kHz knob or the 8.33 kHz knob as appropriate. When you hear the frequency, select it on the radio by following the on-screen instructions. When the frequency is dialed up correctly, you will hear the next frequency spoken. Otherwise, you will just hear background white noise. There are 7 frequencies in all. Here is the first one.
133.135. 133.135.
Well done. That completes the exercise. In this lesson, you've learned a great deal about how procedures have evolved for passing VHF voice communication frequencies over the RT as a result of the adoption of 8.33 kHz frequency spacing in the upper airspace of the ICAO European region. In that airspace, where radio frequencies were once passed using 5 digits, they are now passed, in the new procedure, using 6 digits. But where frequencies were passed using 4 digits, they continue to be passed using 4 digits. If you are a private pilot flying in accordance with visual flight rules in lower airspace in ICAO's European region, these procedural changes will affect you too. The requirement to use the new 6-4-digit procedure for transmitting frequencies came into effect on the 25th of November 2005 for all pilots flying in ICAO's European region, irrespective of whether 8.33 kHz or 25 kHz frequency spacing is being used. If you fly outside ICAO's European region, you may continue, for some time to come, to hear and use the 5-4-digit procedure for the passing of VHF voice communication frequencies over the RT. However, the wise pilot will ensure that he can operate using both procedures. If you're a commercial pilot, you'll fly frequently enough to learn relatively quickly how both procedures work. If you are a private pilot, flying infrequently, you may find that learning about the latest developments requires some considerable study. The wisest advice for student private pilots is to limit yourselves initially to learning the frequency transmission procedure which applies to the airspace in which you fly. Fortunately, neither the 5-4 nor the 6-4 procedure is difficult to learn. and in the end they can both be reduced to the following simple rules, which depend solely on whether your aircraft is equipped with a 5-digit or a 6-digit radio. Radios with a 5-digit frequency display can tune into 25 kHz base frequencies only. Remember the following 3 rules if you use a 5-digit radio. 1. When you receive a 4-digit frequency, always select 0 as the 5th digit. 2. When you receive a 5-digit frequency, simply select all the digits that you hear. 3. When you receive a 6-digit frequency, select the first 5 digits that you hear. And always read back the frequency to the controller in exactly the same format as you hear it. Radios with a 6-digit frequency display can be either 25 kHz capable or 8.33 kHz capable. Remember the following 3 rules if you use a 6-digit radio. 1. When you receive a 4-digit frequency, always select zeros as the 5th and 6th digit. 2. When you receive a 5-digit frequency, that frequency will be a 25 kHz spaced frequency. Select all 5 digits that you hear. If the 4th and 5th digits are both correct, the 6th digit will also be correct. If the 6-digit radio is an 8.33 kHz capable radio, pilots should use the frequency selector knob for kilohertz in the 25 kHz mode only, when flying in a 25 kHz radio environment. 3. When you receive a 6-digit frequency, simply select all 6 digits that you hear. And always remember, read back the frequency to the controller in exactly the same format as you hear it. That concludes the lesson on the transmission and selection of VHF voice communication frequencies.